ladies and gentlemen. My name's Stephen Allison, and I am the coordinator of the Edinburgh SOLAS group. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this debate on the question and issue of prostitution in Scotland and in general. We're very privileged to have Rhoda Grant, MSP from the Scottish Labour Party, who's the proposer of the Holyrood Bill to criminalise the buying of sex, along with our own Richard Lucas, debating Laura Lee, who is a award-winning blogger and sex workers campaigner, and Douglas Fox of the International Union of Sex Workers. Tonight's event is chaired by James Dixon, who I'll pass over to in a minute. If you do need to go to the toilets, they're just outside, and if there is a fire alarm, I've been told there's stairs just immediately out that door. Just go straight downstairs and it leads out to Hutton Road, which is the assembly point. But I think we'll just open tonight's debate, and I'll pass over to James Dixon.
Good evening. If you know our previous debates, you'll know that these conversations that we have tend to come in three parts. The first, each of the speakers will deliver their thoughts for 10 minutes or so. Then we'll move to something of a conversation between the four of them. Each gets an opportunity to ask a question of one from the other side. And then we'll move to your thoughts. And there will be a microphone available in the middle of the hall when we come to that section. And you'll be invited to come up and ask a question. The conversation is at this end. We prefer that you have a question to ask rather than make your own speech or point. So please keep that in mind when you come up to ask a question. I mentioned one or other side. It's worth pointing out that we've got four individual speakers. Now, I'm guessing that broadly two are going to take one view and two are going to take the other. That's part of the point. But they're not actually in teams, and you should think of each of them as presenting very much their own point of view. So I think we ought to get started. The running order is going to be that Rhoda will start, and then Laura will follow, Richard, and then Douglas, and then, as I say, we'll have our little conversation after that. So we'll get straight on and invite Rhoda to speak to us.
This is when I fall off the stage and then disappear behind the lectern. I'm on tippy toes now, I think, but not to worry, I'll make a start. For me, I don't believe that prostitution is a career choice. It's driven by demand, and that demand is met by coercion and desperation. It's easy to understand the awfulness of being trafficked from abroad for the sex trade. Almost everyone believes that this is wrong and should be stopped. However, it's a widely held perception that local prostitutes are working in prostitution through their own free choice. We hear in the news about the prosecution of gangs who groom and abuse vulnerable young girls, passing them around their friends. There have been a number of those cases recently, and what's clear is that the authorities don't have the knowledge or indeed the insight to counteract it. And indeed, some of the authorities saw this as those girls choosing to engage in prostitution. Young people leaving care are prime targets, with low self-esteem and no family to fall back on. Addictions are also a driver, as are violent or abusive partners and family. Poverty is also a root cause. No one could help but be moved when watching the press coverage of Syrian women being driven into prostitution by the poverty they faced as refugees. Their despair was palpable. But sadly, the same thing happens much closer to home. They're not refugees, but they face the same poverty and the same choices. However, the plight of the women in this country being forced into prostitution is not newsworthy at home. As a society, we kid ourselves that our prostitutes have made a career choice to be raped and assaulted, to have your mental and physical health destroyed and your life expectancy lowered dramatically. Yet as a society, we criminalise the prostitutes and encourage the men that use them. Visiting a prostitute for some is a transition into manhood, a corporate thank you, a stag night. things that are apparently acceptable in our society, or at least we turn a blind eye to. Those who purchase face the penalty if they're inconveniencing the general public by curb crawling, but not for their actions. Criminalising the purchaser will cut demand. The vast majority of consultees agree with that, albeit that some do not agree that that is a good thing. It would make men realise that their actions are not harmless and that they are abusing those who are selling sex. They need to have this knowledge to take responsibility for their own actions. Criminalising the purchase of sex would cut demand and also provide another layer of protection for prostitutes. Prostitutes face rape and assault. However, these are crimes that are hard to prove without corroboration. Criminalising the purchase of sex would mean that the purchase was another offence, which would be relatively easy to prove and would provide another layer of protection. While the consultation and indeed the debate often refers to women being prostitutes, it also covers men and transgender people as well. They enter prostitution for the same reasons, albeit that they have the added pressures of homophobia and transphobia to deal with. The bill would seek to reduce demand for purchase of sex in all its forms. Often men fear greater stigmatisation and are more reluctant to access services and then can be more involved in risky behaviour. And transgender people tend to have transphobia to deal with as well, and that can make them more vulnerable. It's clear that those who purchase sex feed off the vulnerable in our society. There are many arguments against the bill which are in my view spurious. That it will lead to greater numbers of rapes and assaults, ignoring the fact that these are happening right now. A piece of legislation doesn't turn previously gentle souls into abusive rapists. Peter Sutcliffe and Steve Wright were not criminalised, but they committed mass murder of prostitutes. And while many said that Peter Sutcliffe appeared evil, Steve Wright was seen as a friend to prostitutes. Many declared his innocence when he was first arrested. And it's right that no amount of legislation will stop the people already beyond the law. They need to be tracked down and brought to justice, and this bill would provide another tool to do that. There are also arguments that prostitution will be driven underground. In order to survive, prostitution has to be available to sellers and the mass market. If it's driven underground, it will naturally be reduced. The proposed bill does not further criminalise prostitutes, and therefore it does not stop them working with the authorities. There are arguments that it will further stigmatise prostitutes, but it's my belief that it will do the exact opposite. It will move the blame for the trade in humanity where it rightly belongs to those who create the market. The bill's opponents call for legislation, the legalisation of prostitution, saying it's the only way to protect prostitutes. And while I agree that prostitution should not be criminalised, I disagree that the purchase should be legal. It will only further legitimise the purchase of sex and would provide an appealing environment for those who want to abuse and coerce individuals into the industry. In Amsterdam, prostitution has been licensed and the purchase of sex is also legal. Unlicensed prostitution is rife there, as is human trafficking and organised crime, to the extent that the authorities are considering further legislation there. We need to change the way our society behaves towards prostitution. We need to fight the cause of prostitution, but also remove the stigma from those who are prostituted. We have to change society's belief that somehow men are entitled to sex. We have to change the attitude that turns a blind eye to those who purchase sex, regardless of the damage it causes others. We have to acknowledge that sex is not a human right. Other countries have done this, and they have changed their society. This has impacted on prostitution and also the whole equalities agenda. This has led to greater equality in the workplace, and especially with regard to pay. And if poverty is a driver for prostitution, then this legislation creating a more equal society would do much to reduce female poverty. Hopefully Scotland will join the growing number of countries that have taken this approach, and thereby building a fairer society for us all.
And straight on now to Laura to give a different view.
My name is Laura and I'm a sex worker with 20 years experience in the sex industry. I came to Scotland in 2003 and settled into a small Highland town with my daughter, who was then very young. As I looked around me, I saw that there were no escorts in the area, at least none very close to where I was, so I set up a website and began offering services, although I was always careful to work away from the town where I lived. In time, one of the locals spotted my site and decided to out me. In other words, they went onto every social media platform they could find and revealed my name and that of my daughter. In the local pub, crowds gathered around a laptop whilst one after the other they called me, making threats and continuing to call me through the night. Eggs were thrown at my car, I had horrendous abuse shouted at me in the street, and dog excrement was put through my letterbox. Finally, I had a local pillar of community not long out of church stroll up to my daughter and tell her, "Your mother is going to die of AIDS." She was 7 at that time, and to have to comfort a small child of that age and reassure them that you're not going to die is not an experience I would care to repeat. At the same time as I was being harassed, another local man returned to the town, having completed his prison sentence for sexual offences against children. "Leave him alone," the locals said. "They've served his time. He's served his time." The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and unable to withstand the abuse any longer, I moved from the area. Something inside me changed at that time, and I began to get very angry. I provided a service where no harm came to any of the participants, and I took pride in my work and in the joy that I spread. Why then was it acceptable to ridicule me and ostracise me in society? I felt very alone at times and started to question myself. Was my work morally right? How could it be wrong to give pleasure of my own body and gain pleasure in return, and knowing that I could provide a good life for my daughter? Then I found sex workers' rights movements, and I knew what I had to do. Change, I knew, was possible. After all, we only have to look at the massive leap forward in the rights of the gay community to see that it can be done. Change, I believe, can happen in relation to sex work too, and we can slowly start to chip away at the old belief systems, the stigma and the whorephobia which surrounds us. Just after Christmas, I came out to my family, friends and neighbours as a sex worker, and the response has been amazing. Now, more than ever, I'm certain I'm doing the right thing, both in terms of sex work and in terms of opposing Rhoda Grant's proposed legislative change. Since the consultation opened, there have been numerous debates in the media, and over again, as sex workers, we have presented evidence which shows the harm that further criminalisation of our trade will do, but to no avail. We have shown how the Swedish model has failed and how decriminalisation in New Zealand has been a success, yet still moves to criminalise consenting adults engaging in paid sexual activity persist. I'm going to use my vast experience at several levels within the industry to dispel some popular myths. Number 1, prostitution is violence against women. I can say that in over 20 years of sex work, I have only felt in fear of my life once, and that was when I was caught up in an armed raid in a bank. Abuses happen, yes, of course they do, but abuses happen in every industry. If prostitution was to be decriminalised, then the heartbreaking murders in Ipswich and Bradford would never have happened, either because the women would be working in a patrolled tolerant zone or quite legally in a brothel. I'm not a particularly stupid woman, and I think I would recognise acts of violence being perpetrated on me over any period of time, let alone 20 years. Number 2, no one would choose to do sex work. This is a statement commonly used by abolitionists, and it's fundamentally false. I made an informed choice to become a sex worker, and it's a choice I've never regretted. In fact, it has opened many doors for me through the people I've met. Over 20 years, I've met a lot of sex workers. Some were working out of sheer desperation, but the vast majority were doing sex work because they enjoyed it, it suited their lifestyle, and it was financially rewarding. Regardless of their motives, all sex workers deserve a voice. Number 3, we are prostituted women. The notion that we are prostituted implies the presence of a pimp, which in itself is an outdated and wholly inappropriate term. In reality, a lot of sex workers are independent now, but there are, of course, those who choose to work for agencies and brothels. In my experience, far from the menacing image of a man decked in gold, a lot of brothels now operate rather like a cooperative, where workers share the running costs and agree on what days they're going to work. The term prostituted women also says that we do not or cannot consent to sex because we are not there of our own free will to begin with. I can and have exercised my right to say no. just as a bar owner can refuse to serve a customer. I will continue to exercise my right to say no for as long as I'm a sex worker. It's my body and my choice. Number 4, our clients are abusers and only interested in sexual gratification. My clients give me the respect I demand and I deserve, and I don't believe that's just because I'm a 5'9" dominatrix. As an industry, we don't tolerate abuses. On ourselves or on our colleagues, clients can and have reported instances where they've seen a lady who appeared to be working in some distress on an anonymous basis to Crime Stoppers. Indeed, I've done a report as a third party on a client's behalf. Some of the clients I have now have been with me for years, and we've become very good friends. In fact, there have been times when I truly don't know what I would have done without them, because that's what friendship is. Like sex workers, clients don't have horns on their head or a look about them. They're Dave from accounts or that man next to you in the supermarket queue. The important point to make here is that if there are women working in fear or distress, sometimes the only person to come into contact with them, aside from their abusers, will be the clients. So why on earth would you sever a vital information source by criminalising every client and ensuring that a higher proportion of suspicions remain unreported? There is another point I wish to address, and that is a comment made by Rhoda Grant in her final consultation summary, where she says, the implication is that if you are elderly or disabled, you should not seek to have a fulfilling sexual relationship. I find this argument offensive. I'm sorry if it causes Ms. Grant offence, but my work with the disabled is one of the most fulfilling parts of my job. For my part, to effectively tell a paraplegic man who also has behavioural issues that he should just go out there and meet someone is about as offensive as it is nonsensical. If there are sex workers like me who are willing to introduce him to cuddles, warmth and the joy of intimacy, then to deny him that opportunity and condemn him to a life of loneliness ought to be a crime in itself. Finally, as this debate is taking place in a Christian setting and the speakers remaining will no doubt raise the issue of morality, I would like to remind you all that if you truly are a Christian and believe in God, then you will know there's only one person suited to the role of judging me, and they are most certainly not in this room. Thank you.
And now, Richard Lucas.
Well, I'd like to start tonight by just saying 3 things that I'm not saying tonight. I'm not saying that prostitution is necessarily always violence against women. I'm not arguing that prostitution is commercial rape. I'm not arguing that prostitution is inherently a form of slavery. So I'm starting off by agreeing with Laura that prostitution can involve consensual sex between adults. So if that's the case, what's wrong with it? Well, I'm going to start by talking about sex in general. Sex creates a deep emotional bond between a man and a woman, a uniquely intimate sense of mutual connection. It unites a man and a woman and creates the possibility of bringing new life into being, creating the basic building block of a healthy society, which is the family. Now, philosophers have looked at sexual relationships and looked at what sort of intuitions people have about them. And generally, people think sexual relationships should be characterized by constancy, long-term commitment, by exclusivity, just between 2 people, by reciprocity, by reciprocal sexual love. And also sexual desire, they say, should be individuated, which they mean it should be a desire for a particular person, not just a general desire for sex. If you said to someone, why did you have sex with Samantha? If they replied and said, well, I just felt like sex and Samantha happened to be there, most people would think there's something wrong with that, something's gone wrong. And the Christian view of sex is in accord with those intuitions when it says the sex should only take place within marriage between a man and a woman. And I believe that's God's ideal. That's what my conscience tells me. It's what the Bible, which I believe is God's revelation, tells me. It's what my reason tells me makes sense. And it's what the evidence supports as working out for the best. Now, when we think about sex in prostitution, it's outside marriage between a man and a woman. It's outside a committed relationship. It's outside any sort of relationship. It's not even for mutual pleasure. It's for financial gain. Now, I expect that such a gross abuse of sexuality will have serious negative consequences. And indeed it does. But number 1, prostitution is self-destructive for prostitutes. A mountain of research shows that living as a prostitute interferes with the ability to form stable, intimate relationships and is associated with a whole host of negative emotional and psychological effects that can't be controlled by harm reduction measures because they're an inherent result of inherent features of the type of work. Now, indoor and outdoor sex workers, there are some differences in how much they're affected by these various negative consequences, but the basic picture is uniform. All sex workers suffer increased risk suffering from these problems. Another fundamental issue with the prostitution industry is the lack of supply of women to meet the demand of men. Because for most women, the thought of being a prostitute is so repellent they wouldn't even consider it. So how is this demand going to be met? Now, as Rhoda said, a lot of people who become prostitutes in Britain, they come from a background of very early sexual experiences, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, drug and alcohol problems, running away from home, housing problems, mental health issues. And they often make the decision to become a prostitute at quite an immature stage. And a lot of prostitutes now would like to leave it, but find it difficult to do so. So I think in those conditions, there's a significant question mark about the extent to which these people can be described as being prostitutes by choice. And also, there is an element of just sheer coercion as well. I think the full extent of that in the UK is not known. The necessary actions never been taken to reveal the full extent of sex trafficking and coercion in Britain, but it's a major issue around the world. Right, problem number 2. Prostitution is harmful to clients and to their families. Clients of prostitutes experience also feelings of shame and guilt, and often find that the sex with prostitutes is ultimately unsatisfying and empty, but addictive. Now, prostitutes nowadays often talk about the way they help the bereaved, the disabled, the lonely, but I would see it more as exploiting them. Sex creates this emotional bond, and a prostitute abuses that bond to hook clients and to make money out of them on an ongoing basis. Prostitutes are not erotic therapists. They're more like drug dealers offering a short-term fix, but long-term problems and addiction. Prostitution damages families by encouraging and providing opportunities for unfaithfulness. It says in the book of Proverbs, the prostitute multiplies the unfaithful among men, and the statistics bear that out. I also think that prostitution contributes to the mindset of contempt to women that's a significant factor in violence and abuse that prostitutes and other women experience. Right, problem number 3, I think prostitution is damaging to the wider ethos of society. Now, this is something you can't really measure, it's difficult to research, but the prevalence of prostitution devalues and trivializes sex. And that leads to increased levels of relational breakdown, family instability, with all the emotional toll that brings. And also a huge financial burden as well. It's been calculated that relational instability costs the UK government approximately £100 billion a year. If prostitution is prevalent, then casual sex seems morally admirable in comparison. If prostitution is prevalent, then the seriousness of rape is diminished. Now, in the light of all these issues, my primary response as a Christian is to promote positive values in this area. But I think Rhoda's bill is also a valid way to address the issue. I think it's based on a very sound assumption that criminalization deters people from engaging in the activity. Now, I have to say, I differ slightly from Rhoda on this. I think the idea of just criminalizing the buyers is slightly unfair to some extent. Maybe it's based on the assumption that all prostitutes are somehow victims, but I think that's not entirely the case. At the very least, if buying sex is illegal, then the person who's selling it, at the very least, has got to be an accomplice to a crime. I think if you want to reduce an industry, the best way to do it is to reduce demand and to reduce supply. It's quite hard to reduce demand when there's oversupply in the market. Now, of course, making something illegal isn't supposed to benefit those people who choose to persist in the activity that's illegal. But having said that, even if prostitution, if the law were tightened up on it, still the same sort of support would be able to be offered. For example, drugs are illegal, but there are still support services, charities, government agencies that work to support and help people who are addicted to drugs. So the support offered to prostitutes could continue even with criminalization. In England and a lot of states in the United States as well, they have a system where when a prostitute is arrested, they're offered, instead of going to court, an alternative of engaging with a support worker, looking at ways of restructuring their life to rebuild it without prostitution being an element of it. Now, I'd just like to finish by looking at some of the agenda of sex workers campaigners. So often sex workers campaigners state that their objective is to normalise sex work. It should be treated just like any other job. The very term sex worker is designed to make it sound like just another sort of worker. Campaigners argue that prostitution should be seen as a dignified profession. It should be destigmatised, just regarded as any other sort of work. Now, if that's the case, I'd invite Laura and Douglas to just think about these things I'm going to suggest. Do they have a problem with them? If so, I'd be interested to know why. But see what you think. Should there be a prostitution stand at the school careers fair? Should a person lose benefits for refusing to take a job as a prostitute? Should employers be able to add sexual services to other contracts, for example, to be a PA? If a young person was homeless, is it ethically acceptable to offer them accommodation in exchange for sex? Would we be happy for the prostitution industry to be run by big business and have the full force of their marketing power, encouraging people to pay for sex and to overcome their inhibitions about it? Whereas now we might phone up the girl down the road to see if she wants to come and babysit on a Saturday night to earn a bit of extra money. Would it be equally acceptable to phone up someone like that and to ask if they'd be interested in having sex for a bit of extra money? If we want to normalise prostitution, treat it the same as any other sort of work, surely those scenarios I've outlined should be perfectly acceptable. If Laura or Douglas wish to balk at any of them, then I suggest that maybe prostitution's not just like any other job, after all. Thank you.
So then, our final floor speaker, Douglas.
Good evening. A modern progressive nation is judged on how it protects its most marginalised, its minorities, those who suffer the most from stigma and discrimination. People who in the long struggle for human rights often seem to be left behind and to be forgotten. Such a group today in our society are sex workers. One of the oldest professions, but often an invisible group, a group denied basic human rights and discriminated against in law. Laws that perpetuate and justify moral prejudice and ignorance, which dehumanise the sex worker as at best a victim, at worst a scapegoat. If Scottish MSPs accept Rhoda Grant's proposed bill based on what is called the Swedish model, then the Scottish Government will further alienate people who offer a consensual sexual service to other consenting adults, further marginalising them and excluding them from society and from the full protection of the law. The Scottish Government will, by its actions, force people who sell sex into an even more shadowy world and force them further into the hands of predators and criminals who thrive whenever the law enshrines discrimination. History tells us that when secrecy prevails and exploitation prospers. This is an uncomfortable truism of human nature and of human society that government refuses to learn, especially in reference to sex work. By ignoring our consent to sex, Rhoda Grant's bill will not prevent the exploitation of the vulnerable. The recent Rochdale and Oxford cases, for example, where vulnerable young people were internally trafficked, represents a failure of local authorities and of government, and yet supporters of the Swedish model appropriate and exploit such tragedies to blame sex work. The exploitation and manipulation of terms such as trafficked, prostituted, and exploited has made sex work too easy a scapegoat for the failure of governments to protect our borders from criminals or the most vulnerable in our society from exploitation, often at the hands of those that society has charged with their protection. Referencing to trafficking, for example, without explaining that UK and Scottish law does not recognise consent or autonomy, simply sensationalises an already prejudiced and simplistic public perception of sex work as criminal, exploitative and degrading for those involved. By this manipulation of public prejudice, the consenting sex worker, the willing legal and illegal migrant, and the genuinely coerced are equally condemned as passive victims. Any proposed legislation that truly cares about justice for people who work in the sex industry, whether they're by choice, circumstance, or coercion, must recognise that sex work is a complex and diverse industry that incorporates many different experiences. When the human rights of sex workers, that is their right to consent to sex, to associate, to employ and to be employed, to receive the full protection of the law rather than be victimised by law enforcement, the government enables abusive and exploitative practices to prosper. Evidence clearly shows that in countries where sex work is criminalised, people still sell sex. In countries where clients are criminalised, people still sell sex. Where governments have created legislative structures that legalise only parts of the sex industry, such as in Holland, people still sell sex. Therefore, when Rhoda Grant makes comparisons between Sweden and Amsterdam, she is comparing legislations which evidence and history tell us are not working. Similarly, stereotyping sex workers to satisfy an ideologically motivated misunderstanding of the sex worker as a perpetual victim in order to justify their exclusion, and which deliberately dehumanises them, is both disingenuous and manipulative. Such manipulation perpetuates stigma and justifies the humiliation of the sex workers undesirable, which is a form of social cleansing, and also promotes an idea of good women versus bad women, which reinvents an age-old narrative which oppresses all women. We sex workers call it horse stigma. When advocates for the Swedish model deny the voices of sex workers, refuse to recognise our consent, and stereotype all men as abusers and rapists and misogynists, they are not creating an environment of gender equality, but reinventing patriarchal notions of prescribed behaviour by manipulating language and statistics that this proposed bill tries to justify the brutality that's inherent within the Swedish model. The Swedish model is now recognised by many leading academics, specialists in the study of sex work within Sweden and internationally as a failed model. Those who read this bill with an open mind and support human rights, justice, and believe that legislation should be based upon evidence should question very carefully the claims made by Sweden. Even the claim that respondents in this consultation paper were 80% in favour of the criminalisation of clients is a distortion when it is understood that those in favour were disproportionately from evangelical faith-based groups. I would ask Scottish MSPs to question claims that the Swedish model has reduced sex work, a claim refuted both by Swedish sex work groups and independent academic observers. Street-based sex work, for example, which may have decreased initially, is now agreed by independent observers to be back to pre-legislation levels. And there are a significant number of migrant workers which confirms reports of trafficking, or rather instances of sex workers, foreign sex workers choosing to work in Sweden has increased. Many sex workers, of course, are now working indoors and using the internet and social media to advertise. Indeed, sex workers advertising on the internet has remained level since the legislation was introduced in Sweden, except now many previously independent sex workers are choosing to work through third parties for anonymity and safety. It is very important to understand when we talk about figures and statistics in sex work that any claims by the Swedish government to have reduced sex work and trafficking are virtually unverifiable. They are conjecture, often based on at best anecdotal evidence, often gathered from the police or government agencies of a partisan interest in maintaining the legislation. The Swedish government, like all governments, work largely on guesstimates when they talk about numbers involved in sex work. Before legislation, the Swedish government guessed that there were between 1,500 to 3,000 sex workers working in Sweden, but in truth did not know, and after 13 years they remain unable and unwilling to provide any independently verified evidence to back their claims that these numbers have fallen. But of course, the Swedish model was legislation designed as a piece of social engineering and based on an ideological interpretation of a piece of so-called feminist theory. It had nothing to do with helping sex workers. It was an experiment designed to make sex work unprofitable or at least invisible. It was legislation intended to terrify men, whom the Swedish government identified as a species dangerous to women, into not buying sex. And it has failed. And I ask you to consider that if this bill is to stop sex trafficking, stop exploitation, then it's unbelievable that the very best people best placed to inform the authorities on suspicions of coercion or abuse are the very people whom Rhoda Grant wants to criminalise the clients. I would ask, why is Scotland even considering this failed experiment when it has success stories to copy? There are countries where governments and authorities have academically accredited data to prove that building a good relationship with sex workers provides positive benefits not only for sex workers but for society. In New Zealand, over 10 years ago, the government chose to engage with sex workers to create positive legislation that decriminalised the laws pertaining to sex work. This decision recognised that sex workers were as deserving of the protection of the law, deserving of human rights as everyone in this room. The New Zealand government chose to stop discriminating against people who sell sexual services and recognised them as entitled to the same human rights and protection of the law as other citizens. The New Zealand government chose evidence-based and human rights-based legislation that recognised an individual's right to consent to sex. In New Zealand, sex workers now know that the police are there to protect them from abuse and rape and discrimination, and they know that their lives are not disposable in the eyes of the law. In New Zealand, sex workers are now learning to trust the police. They are learning to organise and to adopt positive working conditions in partnership with the authorities that prioritise their own safety. As a result, New Zealand and New South Wales, which decriminalised sex work, there has been no increase in trafficking, and the numbers of those working in sex work has remained level. When sex workers have a good working relationship with the police, the benefits are wonderfully dramatic. Even in England, this is starting to be understood. Under the Merseyside model, acts of aggression and violence against sex workers are now treated as hate crimes. That simple change in attitude by the Liverpool police had meant that acts of violence committed against sex workers has fallen dramatically, and convictions have risen along with successful prosecutions. Lives have been saved as a result. What a contrast to the perpetual judgmental moralism offered by Rhoda and her Swedish model. A model that dismisses women as victims while promoting an ideologically prejudiced mythology of men as sexual predators, women haters, and rapists. The truth is, clients of sex workers are no different from the men in this room and the women in this room. They are young and they are old. They sometimes are lonely, they sometimes are disabled. They are just people who buy a service from another consenting person. Finally, I want to talk about just a little bit about sex workers, of whom I am one. Sex workers are a diverse group of individuals from all socio-economic backgrounds and all ages and sizes and colours and faiths and ethnicities. We are like you in this room, no different, no better, no worse, but unlike others, we cannot work together for safety, for companionship, we cannot employ another person to work on our behalf, and we cannot be employed. The bill presented by Rhoda Grant denies the shared humanity of sex workers with you, the people of Scotland. That is unjust, inhuman, and the Scottish MSPs have to understand very clearly that the real consequence of this bill becoming law for the people of Scotland is that to catch the clients of sex workers, the police first have to catch the sex worker. To enable prosecutions to proceed, there is a very real danger that the police may have to use coercion, and there are health implications if condoms are used as evidence. The police cannot prosecute without evidence, and gathering that evidence will have very real human costs. The encroachment on civil and human rights, the cost to the taxpayer to implement a bill that will not stop exploitation but will be abusive and dehumanising, will be financially prohibitive. You cannot stop human sexual interactions, but you can save lives, and you can recognise rights, and only decriminalisation will do this. Thank you.
I wouldn't mind just putting the record straight on a couple of points that were made, if I could first.
Quickly.
Just what Laura was saying about people who were disabled and old. It was Laura that said that they needed prostitutes. I said that they were entitled to normal, loving relationships like everybody else, and to further stigmatise people in our society is wrong. So can I just make that very clear? Also, Douglas said that it was only evangelical groups that responded positively to the consultation. That's not true. In fact, most of the NHS groups, most of the violence against women partnerships made up by police and social work and health groups, social workers themselves, doctors, exited women, support groups and the like supported the legislation. So I think both those points need to be put right. And I would also, I suppose, fundamentally disagree with a lot of what Richard said. I think he was given the impression that prostitution is fed by greedy women who are in for financial gain. I don't believe that's the case, and if that was the case, I certainly wouldn't be putting forward this legislation. But getting back to the debate, sorry, maybe abusing my position of the mic slightly there. But, you know, I don't believe that anybody should face a life of prostitution. And I wouldn't want it for my children, I wouldn't want it for my family. And do you believe that that would be acceptable for yours and your mother, your daughter, your sister?
Is that to me?
Well, you start.
Do you want to?
Well, ideally, if I had a son, I would rather he didn't go to war and, fight to the death on the front lines of Afghanistan. But, sometimes life isn't ideal. I'm asked this question quite a lot, how would I feel about my own daughter going into it? I personally, and you need to hear me out on this one, I personally would prefer my daughter didn't do it, simply because I have brought her up in a protective bubble and she's terribly soft, and that's probably my fault. However, I'm her mother. And so regardless of what choices or turns or twists she takes in her life, I'll be there to support her and love her regardless.
Okay, another view?
I would say, thankfully, I don't have children. But, I was supposed to go into estate management, would you believe, rather than prostitution, but here I am selling sex. So you can't decide for your children what your children are going to do. Your children are individuals, they'll make their own mind up. The only important thing is, if they do decide to become sex workers, I want them protected. I don't want them chased by the police. I don't want them arrested. I don't want them getting criminalised. I want them to be able to have the same rights as I do, as you do, as everybody in this room. And that's a human right, which you're going to deny them, which is wrong.
Okay. Laura, would you like to take a question to the other side or a point?
I wanted to pick you up, Richard, and if you don't mind, on one point you made there, which was that prostitution is damaging to the ethos of society. Well, there has never in history been a society without prostitution. So how do you I suppose, and also I'd like to pick you up on what you were saying about that prostitution reduces the seriousness of rape. There's a vast difference between paid consensual sex and rape, which is an act of violence. How can you possibly conflate the two?
Okay, to answer the first one first, I think there's never been a society without stealing or murder either. But I don't think that's an argument for decriminalisation or the acceptability or anything positive about them at all. Human nature produces all sorts of things which I think are harmful, and society would be better off without. So the fact that it's always been here and probably always will be, I don't find that a convincing point at all. My point with regard to rape is that I think rape is an extremely serious offence. And I think the danger is that we can lose, it's possible, and I think in society we're tending to lose, if you like, the theoretical basis for thinking that. If having sex with someone is really not a big deal, it's the sort of thing you can sell, it's the sort of thing you do casually without thinking too much about it. If sex is devalued like that, then forcing someone to do it becomes less serious than on my view of sex, which is sex as a sort of uniquely special thing that you wouldn't dream of selling or having light. It's not something to take lightly. It's something very serious. So I think everyone at the moment holds that view of rape, but I think the theoretical underpinnings of it are being eroded in our society at the moment.
No. Okay. Well, and then in that case, Richard, your point.
If I could reply to Rhoda very briefly, I do think that some prostitution is entered into voluntarily for personal gain. But I did cover in my talk. I thought there's lots of situations where the consent is questionable or is not there at all. My question, though, I'd just like to give Douglas and Laura a chance to reply to the questions I posed at the end about the normalisation of prostitution. If being a prostitute is just like any other job, should it be a standard at the school careers fair? Should people lose benefits for declining work as a prostitute? Should sexual duties be combined with other jobs? Home this young person, offer them accommodation in exchange for sex, would that be okay? Advertising sexual services, advertising to encourage people to overcome their inhibitions, and just casually just asking people if you can pay for sex with them. What do you think of those things?
There's a multitude of questions there, and the truth is, for example, I'm a vegetarian. I would morally object to being forced to work in an abattoir or anywhere concerning with meat or killing animals or abusing animals. right? So I would say that I shouldn't be forced to do that either. And sex is a very personal thing. It's a very, it's a beautiful thing. It's something that people enjoy. But I think you can't force people to do it. But if people want to work in the sex industry, if they want to, buy sex or sell sex, then they should be protected. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to force people legally to go into sex.
Right. So the school careers fair, you'd be happy with the prostitution stand at that, would you? With information about the college.
I've said the opposite. I think that what you've got to allow is that people, if they want to choose sex, then they should have advice on how to go into the sex industry.
So that's a yes, I think.
Yes, I think if people, not necessarily at schools, but I think they should be allowed to have advice on what to do, what not to do, how to avoid stuff, what's safe, what isn't safe.
But you're happy that it's presented as a career choice alongside all of
this? I think
this?
he said it for himself. Okay. In terms of Laura, what do you want to add anything to that?
I don't want to add anything to that either. I think just to say that what it comes down to basically at the end of the day is individual choice, and we need to acknowledge that regardless of what laws will be passed and regardless of anybody's moral, I suppose, opinion on it, sex will always sell. That's a fact. It's about how we manage that in our society and how we make it safer for everybody.
And can I just point one thing? You talk about sex as being about making money, etc. Yes, you make money out of sex, but a lot of people, like myself, I'm pagan, and sex to me is a benediction. It's something which I do, and I really enjoy giving people the pleasure of a sexual, happiness. And it's not just about making money. There's something very spiritual there as well.
You might want to make a point. I'll get to your own question now, or your own point you want to make to the other side, or either of the other speakers.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Rhoda, you're talking about how exactly are you going to enforce the law? Because you are going to have to catch the sex workers in order to prosecute the clients. I mean, how is that going to work?
Well, you would obviously need to know where the sex workers were working, and you'd need, a lot of this happens online and the like now, as you will well know. So you would need the police to be monitoring that and finding the people. It happens with curb crawlers currently, and the police will find them and deal with them. So it would require police monitoring, and if a purchaser can find it, so can the police.
Yes, but how do you actually prove that? Say I'm in a hotel room or something, and the client's there, and the police burst in. How are they going to prove that he's buying sex or I'm selling sex?
Well, that is down to the detail of the bill, which is still to be drawn up.
But you do realise...
But certainly I would be wanting it to go slightly further than just the Sex Act itself. I would want it to, for instance, go with intention. And it's not just about buying, it's about coercion, it's about exchanging a home to a homeless person in exchange for sex. It's about all those things that people use to prey on vulnerable people to get them to do what they want to do.
But that isn't selling sex. That isn't the sex. That isn't prostitution. That isn't sex work. You're talking about someone who is vulnerable, that society's already let down, who is already out there on the street. Society doesn't care about
and
them.
who is being prostituted. And therefore, the people that are doing that need to be criminalised, and that's what I intend to do if I get the backing of the Parliament.
You're going to hunt down every single homeless person and have a policeman standing over top of them and saying, "Are you being abused?"
I think you're being slightly ridiculous.
But
now,
that's
to be
basically
honest.
what you're talking about. Because to find the sex worker, you're going to have to hunt down the sex worker. You're then going to have to force the sex worker to admit that they've been, that sex has taken place and that they've received money for a sexual service. And how do you do that? Do you use condoms as evidence?
It's up to the police. I wouldn't imagine they would need to use condoms. The thing is that there has been an exchange, because if you're using condoms as evidence, that could indicate a normal relationship. What you have to do is find out that something has been exchanged for sex. And that's
how do you do it?
I will ask the police how they do it now and answer your question. But that's why I am having discussions.
The police don't do it now. The police, don't.
Yeah, of course they do. They do it in Sweden. They do it in all over the world.
And how do they do it in Sweden?
Let's
yes, sir. Just as I think, my tentative proposal that criminalising the selling of sex as well would be sensible alongside criminalise the buying. I think that's much easier, because then you can cut out the promotion and the advertising of sexual services, and that really would be, I think, surely an extremely effective way of reducing the scale of the industry. And that's easier to find, and it's easier to prosecute. It's a lot more obvious.
Eradicating advertising is just simply not going to happen. For instance, many websites are hosted in the United States.
But you just take the number, phone it up, and arrest them. And it's at that stage. I mean, it's obvious. If you look at websites now, it's obvious that people are selling sex. And if it was illegal, then that would be the place for the police to start.
The police will start with where it's advertised. That's, of course, where the police will start, because they will monitor the people that are looking at those sites and their movements and what they're doing. Now, they're not going to monitor every single person, but they will monitor enough to create a deterrent, and nobody knows when it's their turn to be caught and monitored. So that creates a huge deterrent. The other deterrent that the law would create is the people out there who, like a lot of people, believe that the woman is wrong, men do what they do, and kind of turn a blind eye to it. What it will do is say to men, actually, you're responsible for your own action. Your action is damaging, and you will be breaking the law, and you are going to feel the full force of the law if you do. A lot of men will say, hang on a minute, I didn't think about it like that. I will back off. I will change my behaviour, which then stops the demand, stops the coercion, and stops people being pushed into an industry that is damaging.
Okay, so who do we think that leaves then, in terms of the men? I think what that'll leave is the men who have a devil-may-care approach, possibly already known to the police, possibly already violent, don't give a damn if they're arrested.
And, I mean, those people don't care about legislation, so you can't legislate for them, but what you do is put the laws in place so the police can go after them with this legislation and catch them and stop them behaving the way they do.
Okay, what about implementing Kenny McGaskill's idea of a charge of aggravated trafficking, so that we send out a message from our community as a whole, from sex workers, from politicians, and from the various care agencies, that actually we won't tolerate coercion, we won't tolerate abuses in Scotland. It's simply not going to happen. It's consensual sex or it's no sex.
I mean, anything that creates a crime of aggravated trafficking, I would support, obviously, trafficking within the UK as well as from out with, because I think everybody thinks it's people who have been kidnapped abroad. It's not. It's young girls that are kidnapped in our own country and moved around and sold by agencies, many of whom who are very organised and set up clients for them to visit. So we have to be very careful about making it just bad trafficking, because actually bad coercion happens to people living in Edinburgh. They don't have to be trafficked anywhere. And we need to actually change society's whole view about this and put in, I mean, this bill would stop people buying, or at least reduce people buying, which would stop those who coerce and push people into prostitution from actually making any gain. So they would go off somewhere else to try and make their financial gain, and it would stop them pushing people into prostitution.
Well, we got a bit of a conversation there. This is the point where I invite some questions from you. Obviously, we've just spent a little bit of time focusing very much on the political side of the views on prostitution, sex work. Beyond that, of course, earlier in the evening, we've had ideas on the ethical, social, economic issues around the whole idea of sex work. So you may have some points. I'll just remind you, while you're thinking what your question might be, that we have Rhoda Grant, Labour Party MSP and proposer of the Holyrood Bill to criminalise buying sex, Richard Lucas from SOLAS, the Centre for Public Christianity, which is hosting this evening, and also Laura Lee, a sex workers campaigner and a blogger, and Douglas Fox, who's of the International Union of Sex Workers and is also a blogger. He's the editor of Harlot's Parlour. So those are the panellists. Hopefully you've got a question to one or indeed all of the panellists, and I think our microphone is available there. So queue up nicely, and Stephen will bring it to you.
Hi, my question is for Rhoda particularly. I was interested when your bill, the consultation results were published last week, that the press headline seemed to be that 80% of people backed your proposals. However, I was really interested in what the Non-Government Bills Unit had said in the preamble to your consultation document, that this is not an opinion poll and that more weight should be given to opinion that is backed up by evidence and experience. Now, bearing in mind that organisations such as the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, UNAIDS and all 10 co-sponsor agencies that sign up to the UNAIDS Secretariat, UNDP and the UNFPA and the World Health Organization have all recommended that all countries decriminalise sex work, and that even in a Scottish context, in relation to the Equality and Human Rights Commission's recent report on human trafficking that was chaired, an inquiry that was chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy. Helena Kennedy actually said at the end of that report that she did not believe this should be about banning prostitution, because she said that that was not workable in law or in practice. And I suppose my question for you, Rhoda, is do you think you know better than all those people?
I'm not trying to ban prostitution. I think I need to make that clear. What I'm trying to do is criminalise purchasers, which is something quite different. It's about putting the onus where it is due on the people that abuse and feed an industry. So I think that is right. You quote the UN, I could quote the UN, in regards to trafficking and what they've said and the like. There are different opinions, I think, depending on which department you're speaking to. What's clear about my consultation, and I wasn't talking about it being an opinion poll, but what was clear is the organisations that actually deal with the fallout of prostitution are backing this legislation. And if you look at the summary that was provided by the Non-Executive Bills Unit, and you're right, they're independent of myself, it shows very clearly that most of those organisations are backing this legislation because it will make a difference. And yes, they're suggesting lots of other things. I don't believe for one moment that this is the last word. I believe a lot more has to be done, especially about the support for people in prostitution at the moment who need to exit. And I think that's come very clearly from an awful lot of the consultation responses. But there was a huge number of responses from every side of the argument, and I'm really grateful for that.
Any thoughts to add? No?
Hi, I just wanted to make a quick point to the Chair. It might be useful for the debate if we could establish what the legal situation is currently for the buying and selling of sex. Might be useful for the debate. My question was to Richard. You posed some questions at the end of your statement. I think it was careers fair, for homelessness and various different things. Mm-hmm. If I was to change the job description and put in priest or Catholic priest, would you still be happy that those should stand as a job? And what you would either ask or force or whatever?
I think, so you're talking about some sort of religious ministry role. Would that be appropriate at a school careers fair? Yes. Lose benefits for refusing? No. Combine with other jobs? Possibly. In exchange for accommodation? Yes, routinely. Big businesses, I just can't imagine that. And calling someone up to act as a priest for the Saturday night, I'm not sure that makes any sense. So, that's those.
But you asked for a view of the law, and you asked me, and I'm certainly not the one to ask. I haven't an idea, but I think I know some people that would have some idea of the current law, and I'll get two to give me some view of, just so we make sure that everyone agrees what the law is. So perhaps you could give this off, and then maybe you could chip your understanding of the law.
The law at the moment mostly criminalises sellers. It criminalises them for soliciting them, for brothel keeping, for living off immoral earnings. The only criminalisation of purchasers at the moment is curb crawling. So it's about nuisance rather than their impact on those who work in prostitution.
And is there anything we need to add to that?
I don't think so. Is it controlling for gain rather than? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's controlling for gain rather than of living off moral earnings. Unless it's changed in Scotland, is it? No.
And do we know how long people can be sent to prison for, or what sort of fines they should suffer if they?
For running a brothel, it's from 7 years on upwards, depending. And there's various, and trafficking is a really confusing issue because trafficking doesn't. I mean, I was arrested for trafficking once because I bought a ticket for a friend of mine who was a sex worker, because I bought her a ticket, I was a trafficker, which is ridiculous, but that's the way the law is. The law doesn't recognise any consent from the sex worker involved. If they agree, if they want you actually to do something, be taken for a run to an appointment, then you can be arrested for trafficking. That's how the law is.
So that's the best I can do on the law. Now, it's our practice, if you want to ask a question, to sort of queue up. You can tell I'm a teacher. So we've got one questioner here. So if you're looking for another question, you've got to sort of stand in the middle, and then you just take it in turns. And then I'm not accused of preferring the right to the left or the other way around.
My question is it Laura Lee?
Yes, hi.
I was very touched by your story of you and your daughter.
Thank you.
Very touched by that. My question to you is, 20 years ago, had you had some other choices, would you have perhaps gone a more traditional role in raising your family?
I don't believe I would have, no. I made an informed choice to enter the sex industry, and I've never, ever regretted it. You know, it's like any other job. There are some days when you think, to hell with this, and there are other days when I really, truly love what I do. So would I have made a different choice? No. I worked in financial services for 9 years, and that was corporate prostitution. That damn near killed me.
Sorry, this isn't a question, it's just a point of clarification just on the legal situation. What Rhoda said was true. There are certain statutes around soliciting and loitering, but actually buying and selling sex in the UK, including in Scotland, is not illegal. Just a clarification.
So I'm not sure if we're really that much clearer about the law after all, but maybe we are.
I don't think we're disagreeing on that. I think there's aspects that are criminalised, but not actually buying or selling, but there are aspects such as brothel keeping and the like that are criminalised.
Any more questions?
Hello. I'd like to, first of all, state that there was research done supporting Richard Lucas's point that prostitution does diminish the effects of rape or society's perception of rape. And also, I wanted to ask you, Laura, as you're speaking, your voice you may have a legitimate story about having had a free choice in choosing to be a sex worker, but are you part of the majority? Are you representative of the majority of sex workers or prostitutes who are working in Scotland? Are you denying that prostitution is full of class, race, and ethnic discrimination? Are you denying that there's violence and harm and exploitation in prostitution?
I'm not denying that at all, but I think that abuses and harms happen within very many industries, actually. Am I representative of prostitution? I would say I'm representative of the vast majority of prostitutes at the moment. And, you know, when it all gets too much and I get really sick of the emails telling me that I'm going straight to hell, you know, then what keeps me going, actually, is emails from sex workers simply saying, thank you. Thank you for being our voice and for standing up there and putting yourself in the firing line. So, yes, I do believe I'm representative.
Could I just say something about the issue of abuse? I think sometimes it can be tempting to present an argument along the line of, so people are horrible to me, therefore, you know, I must be right. I mean, I could say, I get more than my fair share of sort of online abuse as well, for my views, but I don't think that doesn't mean that I'm right in what I'm saying at all. I mean, there are some unpleasant people who will just mouth off and be insulting and offensive, and I don't think that necessarily justifies one side of the argument or the other.
The fact that somebody comes at me on Twitter and calls me all manner of names doesn't necessarily mean I'm right. However, I'm an expert on my own life and I have 20 years' experience to speak to.
Let me take the chairman's prerogative and ask my own point. I'm interested in terms of the experience of sex workers and indeed the consequences of legislation in different parts of the world, how far it might differ between male sex workers and female, and other issues that get bound up with that in terms of maybe different ages or different ethnicities and other such things. Or is that really a red herring? Is it completely irrelevant as to gender and other things?
I don't think gender makes a lot of difference, really, as far as the law is concerned. It's exactly the same law affects whether you're a male, female, or transgender, or whatever. I think one of the great problems about when you talk about statistics and people who are abused and that sort of thing, is that we don't know how many sex workers there are in the UK. We have absolutely no idea. There's a guesstimate that it's 80,000 sex workers, but we have absolutely no idea if that's true, not true. So when Rhoda Grant talks about percentages or this, whatever, it's a guess. Nobody knows. And you can't really base legislation on a guess. You've got to, first of all, have some sort of idea how many sex workers we're talking about, and then try and work out how many of those sex workers are genuinely trafficked, really, forced into the industry, and who are there because, of 101 different other reasons why they might be selling sex. And we don't know those facts. This is it's moralism. What we're trying to do here, or Rhoda's trying to do, is a moral crusade to say that buying sex is bad. And the big problem with that really is that it's what's it saying to women? It's saying to women, and myself, men who sell sex, you're not allowed to have a choice. You can't make a decision to sell sex. Now that's a real infringement on people's human rights. If I haven't got a choice to do something that is consensual with another consenting adult, that's a real infringement on civil liberties that actually affects everybody in society.
So could I comment on that?
Yeah, please.
I think the restriction, again, is the human rights discrimination type language. But I think everyone has the right to have consensual sex with adults, more or less, as they wish to. It's not prostitutes' sexual freedom that would be restricted by this, it's their commercial freedom. It's what you're allowed to sell. Now, what you're allowed to buy and sell is restricted in this country in a myriad of ways. You can't just set up anywhere and sell what you like to whoever you like, whenever you like. There are all sorts of restrictions on our commercial freedom. What's being proposed is that. It's a commercial restriction, along with a whole host of others, not a sexual restriction. But if we've been talking about trafficking. I think I tried to bring up the research which shows what harms prostitution does to prostitutes. Now, there's lots and lots of studies from around the world, prostitution in various different contexts. But just to run through the list very quickly, these are the sort of things that come up as things that are more likely in prostitutes. Feelings of worthlessness, feelings of self-hatred, feelings of guilt, depression, insomnia, flashbacks, multiple personality disorder, self-harm, suicide attempts, post-traumatic stress disorder, scarlet letter syndrome, which is when prostitutes sometimes worry that people can tell they're prostitutes even when it's just someone they haven't met before. They assume people can tell. Obviously, the high levels of violence and abuse, physical health problems as well, starting and progressive drug use. So these are things not to do with trafficking. It's not to do with criminalization. These are inherent dangers of prostitution. And I don't think we've heard much about those. I mean, do we not want to protect people from those dangers?
Okay, the piece around PTSD and the various things that go alongside that as well comes in the main from a lady called Melissa Farley, who's a well-known abolitionist actually, and a psychologist who has been thrown out of the Canadian courts because her evidence was deemed to be just completely off the wall. She's since been the subject of a complaint to the APA and is currently under investigation. She's a staunch abolitionist and she just absolutely abhors sex workers.
But I mean, this research is from a whole host of people from all over the world. But to my mind, I think that response, it's a bit like my Uncle Jack smoked 60 a day and he got run over a bus when he was 97. I think whatever evidence there is, there can always be a way of trying to avoid it or give anecdotes or discredit this piece of research or that piece of research. But it's a mountain of it. There's a whole host of studies by a whole host of different people coming from different backgrounds that are confirming again and again these emotional, psychological dangers associated with prostitution.
Did I strike you as particularly psychologically damaged?
No, that's the Uncle Jack syndrome sort of answer. But of course there are exceptions. I'm not saying these happen to everyone, but the fact is that they're a lot more likely. In some cases, even affecting a majority, some studies have found, of people who engage in prostitution. I think they're very serious risks.
A lot of sex workers I know, for myself for a start, I mean, I don't drink and I certainly don't take drugs. My only vice is dark chocolate, so, well, that's just FYI.
That's excellent. We've provoked another few thoughts from the audience, so that's terrific. But before we move to our questioner.
There's a comment made directly to me about, we don't know, we can't quantify the number of prostitutes working in the UK. Of course we can't. But neither can we quantify we can't quantify child abuse, we can't quantify domestic abuse. That doesn't stop us acting. There is abuse, we know it. And I think this kind of comes, the balance I think you're asking for us is that we don't interfere with your freedoms, because that might, although that will protect other people, because you want to be free to choose. And I just wonder, you know, how you can put that forward when you know there is so much abuse going on in this industry and people are coerced into it, either by poverty, and I count poverty as a coercion, because if you don't have a choice, you don't know how you're going to feed your child, what do? Do you think that's preferable? If you're fleeing an abusive partner, you know, you're going to be abused one side or the other. You know, where are the real choices there? And it's about getting rid of an industry that provides people with those very stark choices and creating a society that revels in equality. And, you know, this does also correlate with other groups, you know, poverty as a driver, ethnicity as a driver, you know, gender as a driver, all those things where people are naturally discriminated against are drivers. So I think we really need to say, yes, you know, this abuse happens and we need to deal with it.
Can I just say that poverty is a big driver for all of us? None of us would work if we weren't poor, if we didn't have enough money to live. So, you know, if you're poor and you choose to sell sex, that's still a choice you've made. Same as if you're poor and you happen to work in a supermarket or whatever it might be for minimum wage, that's a choice you've made as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. No, not now. And we've got a questioner here, and don't forget our microphone doesn't move. You have to move down to the microphone if you want to ask a question. But we've got a questioner now.
My question is for Rhoda. As you've no doubt been told multiple times, sex workers' organisations around the globe, from multiple ones in America to the ones in Scotland, such as ScotPep, to the ones in England and New Zealand, all of them want to be the ones to decide what happens to their own communities. And I'm just wondering, like, how you would justify being able to control their lives and to decide something for them when you're not a part of their community, when you don't understand their problems, and when you're not a sex worker and you haven't claimed, as far as I've been able to tell, correct me if I'm wrong, that you yourself have a sex worker friend or relative or have any previous sex work experience. So shouldn't it be left to the communities themselves to regulate and to, you know, own their own movement? You know, like kind of like the gay people did, you know, LGBT movements. So that's my question.
If people were there through their own freedom of choice, you could count them as a community, but the number of people that are there through coercion, through abuse, through addiction and the like, you know, you can't, I couldn't hand on heart say to you, you go and make your own decisions about this because it only affects your small community. It actually affects loads of vulnerable people out there that will be forced into prostitution if we don't do something about it.
I think a lot of the arguments put forward there, they could be applied to any crime. I mean, who are we to tell the joyriding community what to do? Do you know anyone who goes joyriding? I mean, surely they can make their own. You could apply it to anything. Any law restricts people's freedom, it restricts their rights, and it tells them what they're not allowed to do. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I mean, listening to some of the language that it criminalises, it victimises, denies the rights, etc. You can say that about any law. That's what laws do. They restrict our freedoms with good reason. I think that's what we've got here. There are good reasons for restricting freedom in this area.
Any thoughts?
And the issues of labour and employment rights would not apply to joyriding in the same way they apply to the sex industry.
If we take, say, the drug dealing community, I mean, their livelihood depends on it. And who am I to determine how they make their living? Well, I'm dead right. I'm going to determine how they make their living. They're not allowed to do that.
And now, Douglas.
I disagree with what the lady said down there. You know, you can't make a comparison between joyriders and people who work in the sex industry who, you know, work regular hours. They do a service to the community. They, they have a normal sort of working conditions that a lot of people have in offices. So if you work in a brothel, you have work certain hours you work. The comparison just isn't the same.
And now a new question.
You say you're against the commercialisation of sex. So why are you not going after the multinational corporations that sell sex at massive profits rather than a proportionately smaller number of people that are all selling sex individually? Surely if that was really important for you, you would be going after them.
Right, could you clarify how you mean that major corporations sell sex? I've got a few things I can... Sorry?
Capitalism sells sex.
In what way? In what form are you talking about?
In advertising.
Yes, I'm against that, yeah.
So that we all watch the media all the time, but we don't all engage in sex work. So why are you not, if the harm proportionately is a lot larger, so why are you not putting your efforts into that?
I would say I do. I would say I would speak out on any issues of...
So what kind of bills are you supporting?
I would support more criminalisation of pornography, censorship of pornography. That's an issue I've written about.
And that's where most of the money is made?
Pardon?
And that's where most of the money is made?
Not necessarily, but I can assure you I have spoken and I'm concerned about the general portrayal of sex in our society. I said, didn't I? I said that was one of the main responses I would make, would be to encourage a healthy view of sex in society.
Next.
I think I have two questions for Richard and one or possibly two for Rhoda, but they're sort of supplementary.
Well,
perhaps
there we go.
But I mean, yes, very brief. I was reminded by the last speaker of a saying I saw, or somebody wrote recently, I would rather sell my arse temporarily to a punter than to sell my life to a multinational. But it raises lots of issues. But I think we must bear in mind that not all careers, bar prostitution, are healthy or cannot be regulated. I finally decided to get up to ask a question when you mentioned that joyriding in particular. You had mentioned that buying and selling various things was restricted, various things throughout society are restricted, and joyriding is restricted. Yes, of course it is restricted, but there's a big difference between restricting something and saying let's ban every single car. That's the difference. And of course, the selling of sex should be regulated. I mean, it may be that somebody under 25 shouldn't be allowed to do so. I'm not in a position to judge. But of course there should be regulations. You also gave a list of problems suffered by some sex workers. And of those problems, for some people, there is no doubt. But when you're engaging in a career which society has said should be stigmatized, which society says is wrong, where society ostracizes you if you indulge in it, where it lodges a hate campaign against you, but not against somebody who's harmed little children. When you're living that sort of life, of course you're suffering a disadvantage.
And your third question?
And when when you buy a mobile phone, you are harming a lot of people in other continents.
Third question, please. I think we made a point on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Are you going to ban cars, mobile phones, and anything else, including alcohol, that causes any problems?
And you said you had a third one, so I'll give you that, because I think I'm guessing the answers to those are going to be fairly short. You said you had a third one.
Yes. Well, it depends on the answer to those questions.
No, it doesn't.
Well, my question depends on that. All right. In that, I won't be able to put a supplementary. But you also, and I think very fairly, and I admire you for doing so, gave your religious views on the whole aspect of sex, which I admire you for. And that's honest. However, do you feel that in 2013, Scotland should be legislated on religious grounds?
Thank you. If you pass that back to them. If you pass the microphone back now, thank you.
Okay, just in terms of the dangerous careers, I think there are some things that you're not allowed to do because it's too dangerous. There's some things where you have various regulations, safety regulations. I think when it comes to this issue, there isn't a theoretical argument either way. I think sometimes people talk as though you can't stop people wanting to do what they do. There's something wrong with that. Well, there's not. I mean, every law has to be assessed on its own merits, and I think that's the case here. There isn't a matter of principle that means you're not allowed to tell people that they're not allowed to do what they want to do. Nor is there a matter of, there's not a principle that you're allowed to do whatever you want to do. In terms of the stigma, I think stigma is a very negative word. I would associate stigma with mistreatment, insulting, exclusion, etc. Now, but on the other hand, I think it's healthy if a society thinks that prostitution is immoral, distasteful, and not something they want to have anything to do with. I think that's a sign of a healthy society, and I think that protects a society, and it protects individuals within it from going down the dangerous and harmful route of prostitution. But the last point was about, in 2013, should Scotland's laws be determined from a religious point of view? Now, quite often on this issue, people would accuse people like me of trying to put forward a moral case, whereas you can only base laws on sort of practical consequences. But for me, there's no difference. My moral beliefs in this area also correlate with harms. When people act outside my moral beliefs, I look at the evidence and I see the consequences of that. So reducing harm and acting in accordance with my moral beliefs, to me it's the same thing. Now, in terms of legislation, you might prefer it to be presented in terms of the harm, but for me it's one and the same. It's not that I think I've got arbitrary moral beliefs that have got no real reason for them. I just happen to hold them. And then there's a separate thing about what does any damage. So I think it's one and the same.
And I think we need some opportunity to comment now, or not?
I would just say that morality is a very personal thing. I think religious belief is a very personal thing. I think in the modern society, the last thing we need is for a religious morality to impose itself on people. People are individuals now. We are a very different society. We're a multicultural society. We're a multiracial society. A huge variety of different beliefs. People don't believe. So for someone to impose their religious beliefs through the cruelty of the law, I think is very wrong.
Next question.
Okay, I was just going to thank Laura for sharing her story, because I found it quite moving, and I think it was quite sad as well, listening to some of the ways that you were treated. I'm quite glad that you're obviously somebody who's quite strong now, and obviously you're able to say no to people. I probably feel like for Douglas, you brought up quite a lot of times the thing of human rights. And I suppose from my point of view, I kind of agree with what Rhoda's doing from the point of view there are a lot of people who are potentially being trafficked. If you look at the UN statistics and everything else, and the number of people who are being trafficked in, and how do you stand up for their rights, and how do your community stand up for their rights? Because, I mean, we have sexually transmitted disease clinics and things like that, but a lot of these people come in with minders. They're not coming in on their own volition by themselves. There are people we know that are being trafficked. How can you stand up for their rights if you want to stand up for your rights, which you're very good at standing up for, but also for the ones who actually can't stand up, who don't have that choice, who don't have that opportunity to say no, for the vulnerable ones we've talked about before?
As I said earlier on, I think I touched on it, our industry is actually incredibly self-regulating and we don't tolerate abuses at all, and that goes right across the board, whether you're talking about top-of-the-range escorts, brothels or street sex. Abuses are simply not tolerated, end of, and they are reported up the line because that's just the way we feel about it. How can we be left to get on with our own devices with consenting sex if we just stand by and allow abuses to happen? We just don't do that. And if you go onto the front page of Punternet, which is one of the main sites in the UK, it carries with it a stark warning about how to look for the signs of trafficking and coercion and what to do if you spot them as well. So we're aware of it, and we do regulate it.
And do you report it?
Of course, I have done on many occasions.
And have you seen action being taken to stop things happening? You know, like particularly, I feel with women who get sexually transmitted diseases, because some of them go back in again and in again and in again,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of feel they've probably not got much choice or they're not being protected in their industry. How can we stop that abuse?
We have a scheme running at the moment called National Ugly Mugs, which is fantastic and is actually under threat at the moment, unfortunately, due to funding, where sex workers can share anonymously details of clients that they've had issues with. Now, those issues can be anything from he robbed money while he was in my apartment, he made me feel uncomfortable, to he gave me an STI. That information is then shared with all sex workers around the country, or sex workers in that particular region. So that goes to further illustrate how much we do care for the welfare of other sex workers, I think.
As long as they can speak English.
Well, it is available in multiple languages, actually.
So I can just say as well that as far as trafficking is a very emotive term, and we actually have to have a much clearer understanding of what the term actually means. Because someone is foreign working in this country does not mean they've been trafficked, i.e. forced across here.
No,
and for those and the statistics that we do have are saying that there's a smallish amount who are genuinely trafficked, genuinely forced, and are suffering.
We don't actually know, do we?
Well, we don't know, but I'm just saying the statistics that the government
they're well
use,
hidden.
the government use, is very, very small.
I don't think that's the case. And if the industry was so good at policing itself, why do we day and daily see the abuses caused? Why do we have so many organisations working with people who have been abused and trying to help them? And that work takes ages. It doesn't happen by one intervention. It happens by many, many interventions to deal with the problems that are caused. And why are people still coerced in? The industry will not and cannot protect itself because, frankly, the people who use the industry don't care. They only care about their own needs.
Can I come in on that? That's right. I think earlier on we had the impression that customers of prostitutes are just sort of everyday nice guys who like to go along for a cuddle. I mean, this is an example of research from America, where they took a group of men who were sex workers customers and a group who weren't. It said sex buyers were more likely than non-sex buyers to commit felonies, misdemeanors, crimes related to violence against women, substance abuse-related crimes, assaults, crimes with weapons, crimes against authority. All of the crimes known to be associated with violence against women were reported by sex buyers, none were reported by the non-sex buyers. So I think engaging in prostitution leads to this sort of mindset, and I think that sort of behaviour follows. I think that's why one of the reasons why prostitution is going to be inherently dangerous, and that's why there's the statistics of such a high number of prostitutes report being abused and attacked in the course of their work.
Okay, next.
This wasn't really the question I was going to ask, but in the light of what Richard's just said, I think you might find that alcohol is actually the greatest cause of all of these abuses that you've just mentioned. But you're not here asking that the drinking of alcohol should be criminalised. The point that I was going to make is that I think there's a bit of confusion in the argument even tonight, because all of the issues that you're associating, I think, with prostitution are big issues for society to deal with in any case. I mean, the fact is that we know that most violence against women or men or children, most rape, all happen in the home and within families. That's where the majority of the problems lie. And I think if we spent the time addressing some of these problems as to why people do that, I think the extraordinary thing that we've heard tonight, and you seem to be in denial, Richard, is that we've heard from people who are at the front line in the sex industry, whereas we know that human trafficking is a real issue for Britain, and we need to equip our police. There's a working group in the Parliament working on that now, and we need to understand how that happens. But it's the trafficking that we have to abuse, not linking the people who are trafficked into prostitution. That doesn't make the prostitution the fault, the trafficking, the forcing of any human being to do anything, whether they're working for a wealthy family in London and never seen the light of day and having no money. That's the problem. Trafficking is the problem, not the Constitution. Violence is the problem, not the prostitution, I would say. And I should probably confess that I'm an MSP and I won't be supporting Rhoda's bill should it come to Parliament.
But from what I've said, though, I mean, in my case, in my opening speech, I mentioned trafficking. But that was a very small part of it. I was talking about inherent dangers and problems associated with prostitution in terms of effect on the prostitutes, effects on the client, effect on wider society. So my case was much wider than that. It hardly mentioned trafficking. Now, you mentioned alcohol and heroin. It was as though there's a general principle that you're not allowed to outlaw things. Now, alcohol is a significant danger. I don't think it should be outlawed. Heroin is more of a danger, and I do think it should be outlawed. So each case I assess on its merits and decide whether or not it should be criminalised. Prostitution I've assessed on its merits and demerits, and on that basis I think it should be criminalised. So it's a case-by-case way of looking at it. It's not there's a general principle that can just be brought to bear on every issue like this.
Thoughts? No?
I've just got 3 very quick questions for the whole panel. The first one is the Swedish government, when they concluded about the Swedish model, they said that increased stigma was caused by the Swedish model for sex workers, and he said that was positive. And firstly, I just wondered what you all think about that. Do you agree if it's positive? And secondly, of course, in Britain, if you're a migrant sex worker, you're automatically classed as trafficked, even though you came here consensually to work in the sex industry. And, you know, I wondered what, I think I know what, you know, Laura and Douglas think about it, but I wondered what, you know, you two thought about it. And lastly, of course, if you, and anyone can do this actually, you can just like Google police chiefs or ACPO, prostitution guidelines, you'll see that the Met Police actually knew that there would be very little or no trafficking for the Olympics, but nevertheless, as we all remember, there was a massive moral panic about it, and they ran into, you know, brothels, they searched sex workers, they took them out and interrogated them when they were still dressed in their work clothes, when they were still, you know, half naked. And they deported a couple of sex workers, but they found either no one was trafficked or very few, like I think it was 2 or 5 were trafficked. So I just wondered, you know, like maybe Richard and Rhoda think about that, or is that a normal thing? Is that something that always happens? Maybe that's what Laura and Douglas think.
Well, possibly 3 questions.
Yeah.
And as I said before, while the responses are being thought of, this is your last chance to come up and ask a question, because I will be inviting our panellists to wrap up in a little while. So I'll accept 1 or 2 more questions as you queue up. But responses there.
Want to go first? Go ahead.
Yeah. I understand what you say about there is almost an accepted link between prostitution and trafficking, and it seems to say that trafficking is bad and prostitution is fine. It ignores the people that are trafficked within our own country, young people who are moved from town to town and used and abused by people. So while there are many people trafficked for the sex trade, and I think saying Scotland is not open for business would make a huge difference to that and make us an unwelcome place. I think we would be wrong just to tackle trafficking, because the abuse goes much further than trafficking. And although I think we can all kind of understand what that must feel like, to be kind of swept up from, you know, your home country and taken to foreign places where you can't speak the language and kept prisoner, that is absolutely awful. But that happens to people who are UK nationals as well.
If I could just
no, I think we'll take this, and then I'd like to move on to the next questions, but please.
I'd like to come in there briefly on what you said about the Swedish situation. Actually, one of the fallouts, aside from the increase in stigma in Sweden, has been that sex workers are now more afraid to go forward to the police and report attacks on them, because the police will then know where they're living and they will target their home with the sole purpose of arresting clients who are arriving at the house. The fallout from that being that sex workers are now being made homeless. So if this is a measure purported to protect vulnerable women, how the hell getting them made homeless is supposed to be of some use to them, I really don't know.
Okay, thanks. So short questions, targeted, no preamble, please.
I'll do my best. It's a question for Rhoda, really. I mean, in doing a little bit of preparation for coming along tonight, I was just looking at some of the previous debates that SOLAS have hosted, and first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for Richard and for being so candid about your views. But I wondered, Rhoda, well, I think that the Labour Party in Scotland is still socialists, and I would imagine that you describe yourself as a feminist. As a socialist feminist, I wondered how you feel about sharing the platform with Richard on the same side of the debate, when Richard, in a previous debate and in commentary on the European Convention on Human Rights, which you described as a Chancellor's Charter, and you said that rights language, Rhoda's mentioned human rights several times tonight, so I was quite pleased about that. You said, Richard, that rights language helps permissive campaigners to delude themselves while they campaign, for example, to smoke cannabis or kill the unborn. And you talk of problems in promoting rights rather than the biblical model of laws. Rights can't fill the moral vacuum. Rhoda, how do you feel as a socialist feminist sharing a platform on the same side of the debate as Richard?
Well, before Rhoda answers that, I would draw your attention to my opening remarks, which were that although to some extent we were going to get views from two sides, that the speakers weren't necessarily teams or together. But I'll let Rhoda speak for herself now.
Indeed, and I think I made that clear earlier on after Richard spoke. I said I didn't agree with an awful lot of what he said, and I feel that what he was saying was actually, and he corrected me on that, and I think came back at me for saying that, but you know, I am very clear that, you know, it's not poor purchasers who are being led astray, and I think that kind of differs from Richard's view, but I will share a panel with anyone. I have been out there and met with Scott Pep, yourself included and others. I want to speak to people about this. I want to hear what they say. So, frankly, I will share panels with anybody.
Can I come back on that?
No, because we've not got time.
One of the criticisms of Rhoda's bill that was put forward by Douglas and Laura was that while certain people might no longer go out and buy sex, there are certain people who don't care about the law anyway, will carry on, and those people might be the more dangerous people anyway. Is it not true, however, that if the police have the ability to prosecute them for buying sex, they may be able to intervene prior to a more serious, horrendous crime taking place against sex workers if they can come against them for buying sex rather than waiting for something else worse to happen?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean. Are you saying that, so for example, somebody's planning a murder, but if the police happen to catch him in the act of consensual sex beforehand, then somebody's life is saved? Is that pretty much it?
I'm suggesting that people who do abuse prostitutes and have done in various of the high-profile crimes, they may be stopped earlier if they were prosecuted for buying sex rather than waiting, the police having to get more evidence or waiting for something more serious to happen.
They wouldn't have access to the sex workers to cause them damage in the first place if the industry was decriminalised and the sex workers were able to work in safety.
Yeah, they would. I mean, people are abused now, but what it would do was allow, I mean, Laura talked about the Ugly Mugs campaign. It would allow people who were reporting abusive purchasers to the Ugly Mugs campaign to actually report them to the police and give evidence of the payment and have them prosecuted. It would get them off the street.
Can I just very quickly say that a lot of agencies actually work very closely with the police, and when the police have a profile of someone who they suspect as being, say, a rapist or someone who has abused women or whatever, they often go to agencies and say, do you know this chap? Have you had any experience of him? Has he contacted you? Here's the phone numbers. I know several agencies that have worked with the police in those circumstances. They won't if this bill comes into effect, I can tell you that.
Next question.
Thank you. It's really just a couple of short thoughts on what you guys think of them, but in my experience, there's quite a big difference between on-street prostitution and people working as escorts. A huge difference, and when we're quoting a lot of the research, we're talking about prostitution. I think if research were to look at people working as escorts as opposed to on-street prostitution, those results might be quite different. So I wonder what you think of that. And lastly, it may have been covered at some point, I arrived a little late, but I would say one of the big flaws with introducing this bill, and the more you sort of criminalise sex work, is that you alienate people and further and further from the services that are actually setting out to help them.
The ratio of on-street sex work to escort work, if you like, is roughly, we know it's between 5 and 20% of all sex work takes place on street. So the vast majority of workers work off-street, if you like. And also, you have to allow for some crossover as well. There are some ladies, for example, who will work in a parlour, and if they have a particularly bad, quiet day, will pop outdoors and see one or two before they go home too. So statistics are very sketchy around that, but we know it's between about 5 and 20%.
And can I just say, most abolitionist statistics they use tend to be taken from very, very small and precise representations taken from street sex work. Whereas Keele University did a very interesting study looking at indoor sex work, and the responses, unfortunately I haven't got them here, but the responses were very, very interesting, saying that the majority of those sex workers loved their job, they thought they had a great deal of respect from their clients, etc. It was a very, very positive feedback.
On the other hand?
There are global trends in where people work. Obviously, street work is decreasing probably everywhere. Indoor work is increasing. But what we see in places like Sweden, that indoor work is static, where it's increasing in their neighbouring countries much, much more. So it actually shows that cut and demand cuts prostitution. But the issues are the same. If people are coerced into working, and indeed that was one of the the arguments used about, the curb crawling legislation that would drive people inside and away from where they could get protection. So it would be wrong to say one is safe, one isn't. They're both inherently unsafe with abuse and rape going on, and we need to deal with that.
Could I chip in with some statistics? These are from Edinburgh, Glasgow and Leeds. Street prostitutes, 81% experience violence, indoor, 48%. Street, 78% cocaine users, indoor, 5%. Tranquilizers, outdoor, 37% using, indoor prostitutes, 79% taking tranquilizers. So there certainly are differences, but I don't think the picture's rosy on either side of the fence.
Kind.
Yes, please.
Let's quickly say the problem is when you start targeting street sex workers, you force them to work alone, you force them to work in more dangerous situations, you have to make quick decisions, getting in and out of cars, etc. for clients, and you make their situation 100 times worse. And plus the fact it makes it much more difficult for outreach workers to reach those people who do have more problems, if you like, as far as drug abuse, homelessness, drug addictions, etc. are concerned. So again, it just makes things much, much worse.
So this will be our last question, and then we will move to allowing each of the panellists to give a very short 2 minutes or so summary of their position or their views or anything that they want to say before they leave us, and then we'll be just about on time.
I must admit I've got a very different view on the whole situation, having listened to all the arguments that I had when I walked in the door tonight. But what I do feel is that we're a small country in the grip of an economic recession, and I think that in some ways we're trying to solve our recession. We're turning our back on religion and morality and what religion and morality teach us and what we've learned from it, and we're saying in recession, well, we must either criminalise or decriminalise something. I wish for a lot of women who are in poverty, who are in need, who are vulnerable, who are scared, who have perhaps fallen out with their families or faced violence from their families and run from that. For all these vulnerable people, I wish there was a realistic choice. I've heard the extremists, I've heard the people who believe in free love and who are pagan, etc., etc. I just feel that for women and for people in general in a recession, we need some sort of choice. I don't think it should be national military service. I don't think it should be something that people are necessarily forced into, but I think that there should be an alternative to people having to work on the streets. What I'm basically saying is, having listened to all these arguments, I'm still looking for a middle way somewhere. But I do believe that ultimately, if someone put a gun to my head and said, make a choice, I would say make the buying of sex wrong, because if the buying of it is wrong, then to me, that takes out the people who are in the marginal ground. I would never blame women who have no other means of income for doing something that they're forced into doing. But I've seen people begging on the streets and being taken in by men. They're not prostitutes yet, but they're getting there because they've got no way of getting home and they've got no home to go to. So I guess it's not so much a question as, where do we find a middle ground?
Well, thank you very much. That's a nice way to finish. Now, we certainly don't force you to go through the eyes lobby and the nose lobby, but just so that you can leave with maybe your own thoughts clear one way or the other, whether they're the same as they were when you came in or different. We're just going to invite the speakers in the order that they spoke originally, just give us a last couple of minutes or so of their thoughts, their position. So start with Rhoda.
Thank you. I think the last speaker sums up an awful lot of my concerns about, there should be choices for women, there should be equality for women. Women should be able to earn the same as men, and that would change the dynamics of this trade quite a lot. Rich men shouldn't be able to buy poor women, I don't think, frankly, and I think this would redress, this legislation, if it goes through, would redress that balance. I would also say to the people who say, well, this is my freedom of choice. Your freedom of choice needs to balance with the people that are being abused and coerced and hurt and are having their lives ruined by this. And I think we need to really look at where that balance happens. As a society, when we see something wrong, we can't just step back and let it happen. And it's the men who buy sex that actually create this market, and they have to stand up and be counted. They have to know what they are doing and understand the implications of what they're doing and be told by society it's not acceptable. And that's what I really very much want to do.
Thank you. Laura.
You know, I didn't actually prepare a closing speech. I just thought I would maybe sum up with a couple of thoughts along the way. I was interested in one thing that Richard said when he said that clients experience shame and guilt and ultimately find the sex unsatisfying and an empty experience. Not my clients, thank you very much. And, you know, I'll just keep on doing what I do. I passionately believe that when two people, two consenting adults, meet behind closed doors for consensual sex, whether money changes hands or not, that is not the state's business. When harm comes into it, it is absolutely the state's business. And I will continue to fight on for sex workers. Thank you.
And Richard.
Yeah, I would just like to agree with that. I think when harm comes into it, it becomes the state's business. And I think tonight I've talked about how prostitution causes harm to prostitutes, harm to their clients, harm to wider society. Now, again, these are my views have a religious element in them, they have a moral element in them, but just to re-emphasize as well, that also corresponds with practical implications. And I think the case I'm putting forward is in the best interests of individuals and of wider society. The thing I'd like to say to finish off, obviously during a lot of this, I mean, I've been basically saying that I think Laura and Douglas, what they do is immoral. Just like to redress the balance a little bit, to say that I'm sure there's aspects of their character and personality in life that are far superior to mine. I would not for a moment like to be presenting myself as a paragon of moral virtue. But the Christian faith isn't about that. The Christian faith is about forgiveness and transformation, grace and humility. So I'd just like to finish on that note.
And the last word.
Well, I think history has taught us that any attempt to impose legislation upon the sex industry that does not reflect the voices and experiences of sex workers not only fails but increases opportunity for exploitative practices to prosper. The Swedish model is nothing new. Criminalising clients is nothing new. Excluding sex workers from the debate is nothing new. And creating legislation that imposes state ideals of morality is nothing new. We've had it all before. In America, they criminalise clients. They criminalise the sex worker. Guess what? Sex still sells. People are still selling sex. Except, you know, people who are caught selling sex are criminalised. That ruins their lives. You know, so. The public understand that forcing sex workers to work alone makes them vulnerable to exploitation and to violence. Sex work is not a problem, but criminalisation is. Therefore, I ask the Scottish MSPs to support sex workers in our long struggle for our human rights. I ask MSPs to recognise our right for the full protection of the law to be supported rather than discriminated against. And finally, no truly progressive nation should exclude people or ignore the human rights of individuals because of prejudice and ignorance. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Well, we've had two MSPs here tonight, I think, so that's pretty good. It's been fascinating from my point of view, but I think to finish off, we're going to hear just from Steve.
Well, on behalf of SOLAS, I would just like to firstly thank all of our speakers for agreeing to take part this evening and for being open to both present their own views passionately and to respond to the audience and take questions. Particular thanks to Laura and Douglas for agreeing to take part, and for Rhoda for coming along as well and being prepared to share a panel with anyone in order to take part in the discussion. And like has been said before, everyone here is speaking on their own behalf, and it's just so that we could have as wide a debate as possible. I'd also like to particularly thank James Dixon for chairing this evening. He's now chaired 3 of these debates for us, and sadly this might be his last as he's leaving Edinburgh. So I would like to particularly thank him for what he's done for us in chairing 3 of these debates, and I think he has done a good job of trying to control panellists who want to speak over him a lot. But thank you very much. As SOLAS are planning on doing more events, and We don't really know exactly what we're going to do yet, but we're going to do different events. There is a couple of sign-up sheets outside if you'd like to put an email address on, and you'll receive details every time we're doing an event. We do have one event planned that's coming up, which in some way touches on some of the issues that's been raised this evening. The event is another debate involving Richard Lucas taking part against Gary McClellan of the Edinburgh Secular Society. It's going to take place during the Edinburgh Festival at Charlotte Chapel on the topic Biblical Morality, Ultimate Wisdom or Outdated and Dangerous. And so it does touch on some of these issues. That'll be on the 21st of August, and if you do sign up for the email, details will be sent out. Finally, can you just all join me in thanking everyone for taking part this evening?